It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussel, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Brussel in Carmel, California. It's broadcast number 525, December 27th, 1981. This is the last Sunday of 1981, an incredible year. The year for me began December the 7th with the murder of John Lennon. That was the official announcement that Ronald Reagan would be taking oath of office in January 20th, just shortly afterwards. They would have eliminated a person he couldn't stand when he was the governor of California. As a matter of fact, there were demonstrations against the atomic bombs and weapons, neutron weapons in Europe just a few weeks ago. And this week, Ronald Reagan made the sarcastic remark about people who don't want the bombs. He said, this is just a rerun of the 60s of the anti-war movement. Just get out the pictures, and it's the same old kind of confrontation. And he put it down. A new generation has come along, but these are the same old kinds of people, so it's a rerun of the old movies. The year began December the 7th, 1980, with the murder of John Lennon, and it winds up with Mr. Paul Marcinkus of the Vatican becoming a cardinal. The Pope is going to make him a cardinal. He's called El Gorilla. He's the bodyguard, the banker, the thief who has gotten the Vatican into a debt of $26 million a year that they're losing. He's linked to Michael Sindona, the financier, who's in the jail in New York for the disappearing act of $45 million from the Franklin National Bank, and Michael Sindona, the lawyer and financier for the bank of the Vatican, who worked with Marcinkus, was also charged on a murder charge. He was over in Italy killing judges and people who had information on his case. And he's linked to Licio Gelli, who's now hiding in Argentina with dual citizenship in Italy and Argentina, who wanted a fascist government in Argentina. When Marcinkus becomes a cardinal, it's time to say, hey, what's going on the past year in 1981? We can't go forward to 1982. I think I should just do a rerun of the tapes, maybe taking each week of 1981 one more week into 1982. Let's relive 1981. It was so crazy, and it went so fast. There were 52 major stories, 52 unfinished investigations, 52 uninvestigated murders. I don't think people can even assimilate a fraction of what is coming out across the printed news media, particularly the printed 10 papers I take a day and the clippings I get from other papers and the books and the magazines and the exposés. There's little news coming out on the radio, but mostly it's coming in the printed media. And some from shortwave. I have a friend who has shortwave, listens to Moscow every night in other countries. There's something coming over there, but very little on the air in this country. But I had several choices for this evening. One is to go ahead on part 3 on the Richard Allen connections to Robert Vesco and the murder of John Lennon. But, Richard Allen's back page news already. He's been cleared of taking the $1,000 from his friends from Japan and putting it in his desk. And the Justice Department was absolutely right. It was probably $1 million, so he didn't take $1,000 and not report it. They were right, and nobody's lying about what the conclusions were. But Richard Allen is back page news, and this week Gaddafi and the assassination teams are taking Christmas vacation. They're in the back page news, and Mubarak has released Sadat's enemies out of the jail, even though that was an acknowledged conspiracy of many levels. Those trials, we saw them in the cage one night on the evening news at the first day of their trial. That's on the back burners. And I thought I would just maybe run through tonight some of the 1981 stories, sort of whatever happened to these people and why don't we know more, and just see what kind of a year it was. Take the hour this evening, or the 55 minutes left, and see some of the top stories, some of the important deaths and what happened in 1981. For those of you who subscribe to these cassettes that are taped off the air, that go out every Monday morning, I'm not going to include a sheet with this tape cassette this week. I'm going to index not every minute name, but the major events that accompanies this broadcast for those of you that take it by subscription. And I'm going to take 2 or 3 weeks to index the past 52 sheets that accompany the cassettes, so that you can look up certain subjects. And I'll mail it to you in several weeks from now. I didn't have time with the Christmas holidays to do that, and I decided that would be a nice thing to do so that you could look up certain names and events and deaths. So I'll get that out to you within a few weeks. Well, as I say, December the 7th, 1980 was a Sunday night, and on that particular broadcast, I was saying last year that the assassination teams from the early 60s, just as Ronald Reagan says the peace people of the 60s are meeting, the assassination teams are all in place, and if they're not part of the murders, they were part of the cover-ups, so I warned, get ready for deaths in 1981. The major deaths that took place, or the attempted deaths, was the shooting of Ronald Reagan, which still the unexplained, no trial yet of John Hinckley Jr. They've spent $40,000 on his security or more. The trial will begin soon. They changed the judge. There's been hanky-panky in the courts. His links to the Nazi Party, to the far right wing in this country have been covered so far. They're now admitting that he had rifle training practice in Colorado, which I acknowledge. I had that also on the table within 2 weeks of the shooting of Ronald Reagan, that he was trained in rifle training in Colorado. That was just in the news this week. I mentioned that early in 1981, or the second to last week in 1980. I mentioned this assassination team, of course. In March was the attempt on Ronald Reagan, and in May was the attempt on the Pope with Ajaz links, again to the CIA, to Germans and Nazis, the werewolves in Frankfurt, Germany, and Spain. All over Europe, he's closely linked to a conspiracy which the Italians admit. We don't admit that, but they admit that he is part of a conspiracy. And then there were several attempts to kill the King and Queen of Spain this year that were averted. Sadat was killed by members of the CIA working with Mubarak and making a successful takeover of Egypt. President Torres of Panama was killed, and President Rodas of Ecuador were both blown up in plane crashes, and they were carefully linked to the international narcotics traffic and Robert Vesco and Richard Allen and the Ronald Reagan administration, as well as the Jimmy Carter administration and the Georgia Mafia. Those planes blew up and those leaders were killed. There was assassination attempt on Mrs. Gandhi, and later in the year we covered the various murders and the near murders, the attempts and the assassins, the people who tried to kill those that did survive, and their links to the CIA, and again to those very people that I mentioned on December the 7th, 1980, that were in place. And then Monday evening, 24 hours after my broadcast here on KLRB, John Lennon was murdered. And the next 3 weeks, I did a 3-part series on the killing of John Lennon and the places that Mark David Chapman had been visiting. And then this last few weeks, I've been making the links to Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, Samuel Cummings, Richard Allen, and the CIA connections to Mark David Chapman in the countries that he visited, in the military bases such as Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, and Beirut, Lebanon, and his trip around the world to Japan, South Korea, and India, Israel, London, Paris, Switzerland, and so forth. I had in those broadcasts right after the Lennon shooting, the murder, some of the activities of Mark David Chapman from Georgia and his itinerary, close itinerary, that was broadcast in December 1980, December the 20th, and I had predicted the night before that the assassination teams were ready and organized and, of course, documented in the cities that this fellow had been to, and now I'm updating it with the links to the intelligence community, the evidence that's come out during the past year. That 3-part series of after the Lennon murder, I gave suggestions of things people could do. They called and wrote letters, and I'm still getting requests for tape cassettes on the John Lennon murder. University of Michigan wanted it this week. They want a tape. I said I've done 6 so far, and I even hesitate to write to them because wanting the information is one thing, and being able to do something with it is another. A lot of people are interested in these subjects, but they can't assimilate it or put it in any context in which they can function to make any changes in society other than just learning the facts. It's very difficult to make that giant leap from learning the information to making any kind of change. In January of 1981, I talked about the links of Angola and Jonestown to the CIA, and Philip Blakey, who worked as a CIA agent in Angola. I talked about Robert Vesco. The heat is on, and he was being chased out of the Bahamas. And, of course, later at the end of this year, we learned how Richard Allen has an apartment and close dealings. We knew that at the time of his confirmation hearings as National Security Council chief, his links to Robert Vesco. But here's a man very closely linked to the world's largest narcotics traffic, to Frank Turpel, to Libya, to Gaddafi, to Idi Amin in Uganda, and Carlos the terrorist. And Vesco is very much part of the entire Republican and Democratic Party. He worked with Billy Carter, Jimmy Carter, and whether it is the Republicans or Democrats, our presidents are reduced to a turf war of the narcotics profits. It reduces itself to that. And in January, I talked about the Jonestown CIA operations and Robert Vesco and his links to the assassination teams. I also mentioned a year ago the relationship of Richard Allen in Portugal and his contacts as the head of Portuguese affairs covering up massacres of the CIA. Jack Anderson had that last week in his newspaper we had on KLRB 1 year ago. And in January a year ago, Tim Hardin died. He was one of the many musicians who died during this year. There are fewer of the well-known rock musicians of the 60s that are dying. There was that trial of the doctor of Elvis Presley. Of course, he got off. His attorney is an attorney for the Watergate case, for the Watergate defendants. And the doctor had unnecessary drugs, and they obviously killed Elvis, but he got off completely free. And I also mentioned last January the role of the FBI in the Jimi Hendrix murder and new papers and documents on the links to Jimi Hendrix. I talked about Reverend Moon and his relationship to international drug traffic and also the CIA. And now there's been a court case coming up, and Reverend Moon himself asked for his papers on the CIA, and Justice Warren Burger turned them down because then that would blow open many links of Moon to the Nazis, to his being brought to this country, to Atlanta, Georgia, through the Coca-Cola and Lockheed and military connections, and the role of Reverend Moon into the military and the brainwashing of America's middle-class children and having them follow him at a great risk to their lives, but a good experiment into mind control. Before the inauguration began, January the 11th, on this program, I talked about the links of the mob, the organized crime to Ronald Reagan, and now his Secretary of Labor is under investigation, Donovan. There's going to be a special prosecutor. He had to pull back his representative to Ireland. He has had various cabinet people linked, associated to the mob. He made an appointment of a man for immigration service from Florida who had to resign before his confirmation hearing because of his mob connections. He has many links to organized crime, of course, and before the inauguration took place on January the 11th, we talked about the links of the administration of Ronald Reagan with Frank Sinatra to Sam Giancana and Lucky Luciano and the entire mob, Carlo Gambino family, and organized crime. And the mob connections, of course, go right from Vesco to the head of the National Security Council, Richard Allen. He's been cleared by the Justice Department of the money in his safe that he got from his Japanese friends, but I seriously doubt if he'll be head of the National Security Council. Again, partly because he used Nancy Reagan as the cover for his operations, and that is what she objected to, and that's what the president objects to, that she was the front or the excuse for whatever transactions took place. I brought up the subject of last January of a triple murder in Santa Barbara that has been covered up. You don't hear a word about it. It was a very important triple murder. Giovanni Showman, Cornelius Mall, and Kimberly Roberts. Again, it had to do with diamond connection, South Africa, London, Germany, South America, a scandalous triple murder that has been carefully concealed. I thought there would be more investigative work on it. There was one article, The New West, but again, whatever happened to the case of the three murdered people at the art gallery in near Santa Barbara. I talked about the psychiatrist for Mark David Chapman, Dr. Diamond, who had hypnotized Sirhan Sirhan, Chapman was then in jail for killing John Lennon. And another psychiatrist who testified and hypnotized Chapman at the trial has now been charged with a fraud. He didn't have the degrees he said he had. He could come in and hypnotize the man who shot John Lennon, and now he's under investigation because of his credentials. He was lying about that. There were some new books I brought up last January, and continuously through these broadcasts I've suggested different titles. One was Hitler, the Survival Myth, another The Spider Web by Joseph Persico, and another book, The Pope, the Premier, and the President. That's Pope John the 23rd, Khrushchev, and John Kennedy. John died in the spring of 63, Kennedy in the fall of 63, and Khrushchev was removed from office. The three of them were very close, and then they were all out of office, and D'Entente was over, and the name of the game after November 63 was World War III, Let's Get Going. Another book I suggested, the first of last year, was A Great Heroin Coup, which is a good book written by a fellow in Europe, Heinrich Kruger, in case you haven't read it. I had a guest on this program, Bill Kaysing, who wrote a book, We Never Went to the Moon, and there is a new edition of that book out if you want to read it. And also, I brought up last January the Lindbergh baby hoax and how Bruno Hauptmann was charged with the murder of the Lindbergh baby, and he didn't do it. And in the past year, just a year later, they have released information about Bruno Hauptmann, and the consensus is that he was, in fact, framed, that he didn't kill the Lindbergh baby. And we were talking about that about 9-10 months before it came out in the news. There was a new book out by about Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, and I was showing the comparisons in the mind control LSD programming between David Berkowitz and Mark David Chapman, who shot John Lennon. This was on a broadcast last January, a year ago in 1981, and then later it came out, Berkowitz during the year said that he had information about murders out here in California at the Stanford campus, that he had met a person who had met one of the people, the woman killed in the chapel at Stanford. And then there was more news items about Berkowitz not being the man who did all the murders, or maybe any of them, in New York City, Son of Sam, that there was another person with a gun and maybe Sam didn't do them. I don't doubt that Mark David Chapman shot John Lennon. I also think there was a backup team, as there is in these other murders, and he got away. But I was making comparisons of Chapman to David Berkowitz a year ago. Also, the government Klan complicity in the Greensboro killing we were talking about last January, and the murders and agent provocateurs at the trial of the Nazis and the murders in Greensboro. And then later this year it came out that a member of the jury was an anti-Castro Cuban who belonged to a Nazi group of, he was part of the Bay of Pigs operation that was headed by E. Howard Hunt and the famous Edwin Wilson and Theodore Shackley. And the Nazi connections to the jury came through loud and clear, in addition to the provocateurs that set up the murders in Greensboro. A member of the jury was part of the government CIA establishment. The electoral process I put down after the inauguration, January 25th, and talked about the hanky-panky that was going on, and also the role that Brzezinski would have in fomenting trouble in Poland and Afghanistan, and the problems that the Reagan administration would have in handling foreign relations. I also talked about the cabinet that looks like a millionaire's club and listed the millions of dollars of the members of the cabinet Ronald Reagan put together. And of course, nobody would deny that his administration is a big business administration. I talked about the Mitchell Werbel and Cobra International and the anti-terrorist training, his links in Atlanta, Georgia, and his silencers to the assassination teams. And Werbel's name has been in the news quite a bit. He is now dying of cancer, and he sold his company to a firm in Texas, and they're working with Mr. Beckwith, the man who was so unsuccessful in rescuing the hostages. And these fellows are up to a lot of domestic training for the overthrow of this country and training special forces and people that you see going out as mercenaries. They tried to take Dominica again this week. They weren't successful again, but once they're going to win and get one of these little islands where they can do what they said they wanted to do, which was to print Nazi literature and find a home base for Robert Vesco to become king. Last year in January, Marguerite Oswald died. She went to her death saying that her son was innocent, and it's a shame that more researchers and people never went to her or knew her or used her information. She had a lot of information, and it's now going into a library in Texas. All of her books, all of her documents are going to stay together so that the researchers will be able to go there and look at information. I hope it won't be screened out and taken out for national security, the things that she has about Lee Harvey Oswald. But she had a lot of information, and some of it she was keeping for herself to put in a book that never came out. She passed away last January. Ronald Reagan had his first press conference in February, as soon as he was president, and he accused the Soviet Union leaders of being willing to lie and to cheat and commit various crimes. And then he opened up the White House and entertained the president of South Korea, who killed the former president Park Chung-hee at a dinner party and became president himself. And he was entertaining a well-known murderer and accusing the Soviet Union of doing the murdering. There was an important trial in San Francisco that was completely covered up. Darlene June Cromer, she had strangled a little boy, a black boy in Oakland. I talked about that last January, but she talked about working with an aide to Richard Nixon, to being involved with $13 million investment, the Italian mafia, that the killing of black children was something they enjoyed doing. And at the time of her trial, a lot of information came out about the cloak and dagger world, the U.S. Army, the British intelligence, and of course that was all hushed up. It had to do with billions of dollars and killing black people, and she had bragged about only 300 been killed. We also saw the Atlanta, Georgia murders, a string of those that went on, and then they brought in a man who's been in jail 6 months. That trial is about to begin, and the newspapers say there's very slim evidence. The police have reported that they do not have to announce how many children are missing in Atlanta, Georgia. Children are still missing. They're gone, even though this man is going to trial. There are lots of children missing and killed, and they put a clamp on letting anybody know how many since he was arrested, but they're going on continuously, and they're going with slim pickings to try and pin on this one man who may or may not be like Bruno Hauptmann. But for some reason or other, the black community sits quiet. The black leaders say nothing, just as the Jewish leaders are quiet when the Nazi incidences come up. And Nazis like Mr. Otto von Bolschwing appear, they say nothing. I really don't quite understand the general indifference that some people can't catch on to some of the events that are going on, whether the young people with the musicians being killed, particularly after John Lennon, or the Jewish organizations with people like Otto von Bolschwing, who worked in the CIA for 30 years, who admits that he set up the program for Adolf Eichmann and persecuted innocent women and children and murdered them and did medical experiments on them and did all kinds of intimidation. He admits this. It's in the newspaper last week, and there's this overall silence. I almost thought this evening to wind up the year by just reading the TV guide of the movies that are on TV this week. There is so much entertainment. There are so many movies. There are so many distractions that it is impossible for people to say, I'm going to sit and read this book, or I'm going to listen to this talk show and call up, or I'm going to write this letter to the editor. There is just a mass of entertainment, and it is a stroke of genius to give people satellite TV, satellite sports, satellite plays, movies without interruption, because they have the average home statistically has 4 hours of television every single night or day. 4 hours in every single home in America, and for those that don't have it, the others have 8 or 12. And that is the kind of mesmerizing that goes into the minds of American people so they can't assimilate a lot of this information. In February, Harold Smith appeared. This was the Wells Fargo story. Remember how important the Wells Fargo Bank was? He said it involved 200 to 300 million missing. It involved Muhammad Ali and trips to Australia and Hong Kong and the CIA and the Nugan Bank in Australia. This was a big story. Well, Harold Smith is having what you would call a mini trial, just a little trial in Los Angeles. It stops and starts. I take the LA Times. You can't make any headway of it. They don't bring up anything about Muhammad Ali or their trips of Harold Smith and Ali to Guyana right after Jonestown. And when the story first broke, it had to do with an oil company in Angola that was going to give Harold Smith $80,000 it was, on a regular basis through the Wells Fargo Bank. And I don't know if that bank there, the country of Angola, was linked to one of the countries that Richard Allen was involved in when he was involved with Mozambique and, in quotes, other African countries. But this Wells Fargo case involves Caesar's World, which is the Frank Sinatra connections, and the Gulf Western and the Madison Square Garden and the boxing world. It was a huge scandal, and it was out in the news for 3 to 4 weeks, and I had maybe 60 or 80 files on the Wells Fargo. And then suddenly everything was quiet. Muhammad Ali was kept under control, he said, by the CIA. They were watching every move he made. And simultaneously there was a story about Sir Y.K. Powell from Hong Kong. And last February, almost a year ago, I did a broadcast here on this about him, and he was on 60 Minutes about 2 weeks ago. D.A. Jensen from California was appointed by Ronald Reagan to a high justice post in February of 81. I talked about that, and he was the strong law and order man who covered up the SLA and their links to the CIA, to the free speech movement in Berkeley. He was working in California with Edwin Meese III and Ronald Reagan with Operation Chaos and the COINTEL program, and Reagan was to make him the Assistant U.S. Attorney General in charge of Criminal Division last February. Well, Jensen got to Washington and is the Assistant U.S. Attorney General of the Criminal Division, and he closed all offices in Texas, of all places, for organized crime, for investigation of narcotics. They're closing the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. They're letting the mob have control of every major city, and he's the man in charge of the investigation of Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, and George Corcola. So the thieves handed over the entire operation to a man who was part of the destruction of law and order in California, who set up COINTEL operations, that is counterintelligence operations, and who covered up the San Quentin Six trial, the Soledad brothers. He was in Oakland and in that area when they were making a lot out of the Black Panther Party and Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton and a bunch of funky dope-dealing, cocaine-sniffing black radicals who came out and became, our establishment representatives. I think Eldridge Cleaver has now joined the Mormon Church and running for mayor of Oakland. But Jensen, in February, was pointed to a position of power by Ronald Reagan. He brought his California scum back to Washington, and now they're turning their back on the crimes that are linked to the past and are continuing to be exposed in little bits and pieces. In February, the end of February last year, we did quite a few broadcasts on the importance of the Nugan Bank in Australia. There's a big article in New York News by Joe Volz on bank failure stuns ex-CIA military men. This is the New York News on the Pacific Holding Company in Australia, the links to Air America, to the CIA, to William Colby, Frank Nugan's murder, drug traffics, outright cocaine, heroin traffic of the CIA, and the taking of $55 million to $1 billion that's floating around and missing. There were several good articles on Nugan Bank this last year, and I covered every single one of them on this program, and they also funded Michael Townley down in Chile and Colonial Dignidad, the Nazis in Argentina and Chile, and the torturing that has been going on linked to the murder of Salvador Allende and later Orlando Letelier. The Letelier case has been covered up. The Karen Silkwood case was negated this last week. There's still a lawsuit on the murder of Karen Silkwood. The Nugan case is in limbo. The whole year it was shut up. the Michael Sindona story. Oh, yeah, he tried to escape. I forgot in February last year, Sindona was on the balcony of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, the financier of the Vatican, who has been charged with murder and so forth. He's with one of the largest drug dealers in the United States, Robert Weiler, and the helicopter couldn't rescue the two of them. The drug dealer from New York and New Jersey with the financier of the Vatican, a lawyer, financier, robber, manipulator of funds, working with the Pope and the international fascists. When the helicopter got up there, they forgot to bring the wire cutters. Make a marvelous movie, but Sindona's up on the balcony with Weiler, and the helicopter had to leave. Weiler and Sindona were both mixed with the Carlos Gambino family, the links of the Vatican to the mob, and the escape didn't work. Weiler's still in jail, and so is Sindona. And I guess the helicopter driver got pretty frustrated because he forgot to bring his wire cutters. But he had a couple of big guys on the balcony, and it was pretty funny the way it failed. I covered from end of February and March the Wells Fargo case, and then the Valerie McDonald story, another big story that has been covered up. San Francisco Chronicle Examiner front page, CIA linked to the curious case, the mystery of the disappearing actress. 9-10 months later this week, there's an update that I'll get into details with you in a few weeks on Valerie McDonald. It had to do with money going down to weapons in El Salvador, with the CIA, with drug dealing, with the Japanese mafia, with the Vatican, with Rome, with United Nations. It was a scandal that touched international basis at many places, and the story of Valerie McDonald has been quiet for the last 10 months. We'll take a 1-minute break and go back to some of the scandals that have still been kept secret for this past year, and maybe we should just go back and review them for a while.
You're listening to World Watchers International over FM 102 KLRB. And now, here's May with part 2.
Okay, we'll go back to some of those great stories. Whatever happened to the Valerie McDonald story was important because the people that were suspected of murdering her, John Gordon Abbott, he's in a jail up in British Columbia, and his companion, one of the fellows, Mr. Hennessy, was murdered, but there was a Philip Thompson and John Gordon Abbott who are still alive. And they had in their possession the names of officers of banks that they could only get from the inside of the bank, a handful of 5 or 6 people in the bank that would have information of these officers. And they had file folders of the armored car companies and commercial firms that they served, and they were planned for robberies for United Parcel Trucks and Loomis and Brinks and the cash-collecting vans and the Hibernia Bank. And they had the home addresses of every driver and the name of their children and the Social Security numbers of the particular drivers and the driver's license numbers and the ages of the children and their school schedules. And they had the most minute details, which would show, like the SLA operation, that this large scam of robbing banks and sending money down to Nazi right-wing organizations in South America that then turned it into Nazi literature and cash and heroin and cocaine that came back to the United States that was recycled for more money and then guns sent back down to them. This operation was a large scandal, and this particular woman was murdered, and it involved politicians in San Francisco and former prison guards, and it's been in limbo this entire year, and a lot of the clues were available. A similar bank robbery took place, a Brinks robbery of a fellow in San Francisco who was a member of the Nazi Party who had gone down to Florida, and he was at the United Nations at a party. He took over $1 million, and he gave away about $100,000. When he came home, they compared him to Robin Hood. He'd been down Jacksonville, Florida, and the UN and fancy parties that gave money to people. And because he gave $100,000 away, he's getting a lot of soft treatment out here by the press as if he's a very great fellow who gave to the poor. They still haven't said where the other $1.5 million went, or his role with the Brinks, or how he got out of town. Last March, we were talking about Nugan Hand Bank again on March the 8th. The important stories, one from the London Times on John Paisley, another Washington Post story by Maxine Cheshire, and Lee Edwards from the Globe and the San Jose Mercury. Very important articles, and again, linked to the Japanese mafia, to Tokyo, to William Colby, the part that would connect to Richard Allen with his contacts in Japan and to the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Department, all kept quiet, and not a word came out. February, March, and April was a time of breaking down the international links of the Wells Fargo missing millions, which, again, the lid was put on. Money gone from the Beverly Hills Bank, the Palisades Bank, the Hollywood, Wilshire branch, and Marina Del Rey, and Harold Smith again saying it was the Japanese mafia. And shortly after that, as many stories came out, the Japanese mafia boss, Mr. Teoka, was murdered. This was in July of this year. And in March and April, the Wells Fargo story was very big. The role of the Falcon and the Snowman, that's Christopher Boyce, appeared. He surfaced up in was Port Angeles, right near across the water from Victoria. He's up in Washington and Port Angeles. And the book Falcon and Snowman is about Boyce, the double agent, the CIA man, and again, I believe that his Palos Verdes links to the Wells Fargo Bank could be established. He was apprehended and taken to a federal prison, and now he's back in California, I believe at Lompoc, but he was learning to fly an airplane and was ready to leave the country. He stayed at an Idaho safe house. The woman was charged for harboring him, and then she was released, just as the Mickey and Jack Scott were never charged with taking Patty Hearst. In these major conspiracy cases where it is a crime to harbor somebody who is under indictment or has escaped from prison, these people who take care of them, who have the CIA safe houses, are released from all charges, as happened, say, with the Scotts and with the woman who had Christopher Boyce. I talked about not only the Nugan Hand and the CIA Bank, the Castle Bank that was set up originally before the money went to Australia, to the Nugan Hand Bank, but some examples of missing millions and billions of dollars that have been floating around. Now, there are articles at the end of this year in New York Times, Wall Street Journal on our banks folding, the savings and loans collapsing, financial crisis in banks. But nobody makes any connections to the major banks that collapsed or where the money went or who was tampering with the banking system. So last March, I gave some examples of Richard Nixon's friend C. Arnold Smith with his U.S. National Bank that folded, 200 million scandal. The bank house in 1974 in Germany, 200 million gone. In October of 74, the Franklin National Bank, the 45 million that was siphoned off by Michael Sindona of the Vatican. In 1977, the Swiss Credit Bank, 800 million gone. The Chase Manhattan Bank in Switzerland, 400 million gone. I did many programs this past year, 1981, on the missing million. And the reason I was concerned was that this is the way that Japan and Germany funded the regrowth of their countries after World War II by taking millions and billions of dollars of cash, of gold, of counterfeit money, salting it away, and then bringing it back for particular businessmen to set up corporations all over the world to be sure they controlled newspapers, radio stations, hotels, airplane companies, and so forth, so that all the major industries would be controlled by people who had salted this money away that, in quotes, is missing, but has to be somewhere, and somebody is going to be using it for their purposes. You can be sure of that. Now, there was a very large story last March that just died in limbo, a New York Times story, and also in the Globe, on the heels of an accused con man, Eduardo Rabi, R-A-B-I, who used the name Jack Bender. There was a Nazi named Bender who also had the German name of Sven. I can't find out if this Jack Bender is the same as the Sven. There was a Bender who helped form Israel. This fellow was an Israeli also. He had passports from different countries and had citizenships and false identities. He could travel all over the world. He was in New York and Switzerland and France, Monaco, Italy, Canada, Paraguay, Uruguay, working with down in Paraguay with Dr. Joseph Mengele. He left $14 million there behind for Mengele and for Uruguay. He had $14 million he left behind. He was wanted on a $60 million swindle. There's $1.4 million missing in Toronto, $14 million of it paid out in Paraguay, $50 million lost from a Swiss insurance company, and $300,000 to $70,000 out of Beverly Hills diamonds and so forth. Now, many times through this past year, and I've been charting it as much as I have time to do, the name of the bank, the city, the date, the amount of money, and the countries involved and the people to see, and I have added up several times how many missing, millions and billions of dollars. And unless we know where it's going, we can't really plan a very stable future or figure out why situations are being destabilized. People come into the major cities and plunk down cash, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 homes, $2 million homes. The real estate market is crazy. The banks are unsettled. The savings and loans are going under. As I say, the financial system in this country is really in chaos for many, many reasons. But the large amount of money taken from these banks that is unaccountable is outrageous. There was another story, a financial scandal that rattles the Pacific. That was about Billy Lee, and it had to do with the San Francisco Bank and $18 million that was taken out of the Hollywood National Bank and Hong Kong investments. Again, the Japanese garment industry with Mitsubishi, Hong Kong investments, and textile companies, January the 9th, 1981, $100 million. They believe $70 million to $100 million was taken, the largest ever taken out of Philippines. It involved Vancouver, British Columbia, and Haiti. A lot of money floating around. The Philippines are in debt to the United States, $10 billion in debt. And I mentioned last week how Poland is in debt so much they have an interest of $450 million this week and don't have a cent. Yet the money poured into there. Where did it go? Did it go to it didn't go to factories. It didn't go to housing. It didn't go for supplies or farms. Where did the billions go into Poland that are not seen? Some friends believe it went to the Catholic Church so that after the martial law comes and maybe the communists are overturned, then the money will be sold away for certain particular people to become wealthy and to run the country, that it's salted away and hidden now, and it was sent by the Western banks. But in the meantime, the interest is due, and it's unaccountable for. Well, the same way the Philippines has a $10 billion debt to the United States. We, citizens, have to pay the debt if they can't. So they take all their capital out of the country and say, whoops, we don't have any money. In the meanwhile, it's hidden someplace. It doesn't make a bit of sense, and I don't see how it can keep on and on. But the articles that I have are from papers such as the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the financial sections and the news sections, and it seems that these things are happening. San Francisco had robberies. $45 million was missing last year, and there were 800 cases of embezzlement. In March last year, I did 1-hour book review of Best Evidence by David Lifton. That was on the murder of John Kennedy. Lifton was a good researcher. He worked 15, 16 years. He got sucked in. He did a rotten book. It's a perfect example of how a good mind can be seduced by forces around you to produce something that is terrible and not what started out with your intent to be the definitive book on the John Kennedy assassination. It was a big brahoo in Time magazine. It made the Book of the Month Club. There is hardly a researcher that thinks it's worth anything, and it kind of ruined the reputation of David Lifton. People were waiting to see what he produced, and I did a broadcast on what was wrong with the book and went down many points, but one of the points was that he had to prove something to the CIA and to Wellesley Liebler that their innocence in making mistakes on the Kennedy assassination came from mere ignorance, not complicity as criminals. And that's where Lifton went wrong. The CIA covered up the murder of John Kennedy. They seduced Lifton to become neutralized. Their intent was never honorable. There was not information that they didn't have access to. They destroyed evidence of the murder. They locked up evidence of the murder. They lied under oath. They didn't call the right witnesses. And where Lifton went wrong was that he wanted to say, well, there was a conspiracy, but you guys just didn't get the point because there wasn't this material available then, but you meant well. And when he gets to that point, he's over the brink. He may as well walk the plank and sink. You lose a major researcher because he has human flaws, and they got to him. And that's what happened to David Lifton. In March of last year, I talked about the top dogs fighting. That was one of my favorite broadcasts of 1981. It was on Sunday night, and I defined Alexander Haig and his fight with Richard Pipes and Richard Allen and Mr. Casey and Walter Stessel. Walter Stessel was on Face the Nation today. Interesting program talking about Poland. He was our ambassador to Poland, our ambassador to Germany. He was our ambassador to the Soviet Union when Lee and Marina Oswald were in Navy intelligence. Well, that was March 29th, and the program, I've referred to it many times, The Top Dogs Are Fighting, and I was talking about Alexander Haig and his role to the assassination teams. And the very next morning, Ronald Reagan was shot, and there was Haig saying that he was in charge. And ever since then, Mr. Allen and Mr. Casey and Pipes and Stessel and Haig and Ronald Reagan have been fighting with each other. Before John Lennon was shot and before Ronald Reagan was shot, I was telling you on this program that this action would be taking place, and it did very shortly, 24 hours later. Sometimes it takes a year for something to happen that I talk about, or 2 years, but as luck would have it, the timing and the space for them to do what they were going to do had to be at those moments, actually, because there's a certain desperation about these people, and that's one of the things that makes studying this news so interesting. What's interesting about it is how frail the leaders are, such as Lyndon Johnson and Gerald Ford or Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan. We have no leadership, or the desperation that Great Britain puts in Margaret Thatcher when so many people hate her. The only countries where the leaders can look at you eyeball to eyeball and make sense are the countries that came in this last year, such as Mitterrand in France and Papandreou in Greece, or even Brezhnev in the Soviet Union. And Gaddafi, who people think is crazy, he can say Ronald Reagan is an actor and a liar. I'm a revolutionary. And all three are true. And there's something about Gaddafi when you see him and hear him that I don't believe he's as crazy as certain writers want you to believe, or that he's deranged. There's something about him when he talks that makes sense. If you don't want to believe it, just forget it and say he's crazy. But his actions will hold up. In the meanwhile, people like Reagan they're fighting Allen and Mr. Meese. Edwin Meese is going to leave the administration shortly. He's ready to get out. And Mr. Devers said that he's leaving, and Lynn Nossiger is leaving. And there's a lot of people shaky on that ship. As I mentioned last week, Lenore Annenberg left. It's a crazy group of people, and it's fun to watch them because they're so frail and they're so rotten. I got a nice Christmas present, the Ronnie and Nancy Reagan paper dolls, and I hope I have to get another set, because one I'll keep intact and the other I want to cut up and play with. They're so cute, and I can change their costumes. And she has a little belt that says Evita Peron on it, and he has a library with the Beverly Hills Diet and some rotten, easy books, easy economics, and so forth. I love the paper dolls, and I think it would be a ball to play with them because, as I say, they're so vulnerable and they're so rotten, and the people around them are so rotten. If you've studied them 18 years like I have, it's not, the news isn't sad to read because there is the balancing power opposing them. Now, before I go on to some more of the broadcasts here, I might mention Walter Stessel tonight on Face the Nation, the former ambassador to these various countries, Poland and Germany. He was so mild, you might even want to send for the program to read it. Butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. He didn't say a word against the Soviet Union. He was supposed to be talking about Poland. I couldn't get a sentence that made sense. Starting last February and March, they were going to wipe Poland off the earth, that communism couldn't exist. they'd have to change their form of government, Mr. Richard Pipes said. And Allen, and they were accusing them of being killers and terrorists, and the Soviets would respond, well, you killed the president of Panama, the president of Ecuador, and you killed John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And they're getting very verbal the first time that the Soviet Union, or even Gaddafi, but particularly the Soviet Union, is listing the crimes that these people did and answering them. And they're looking like statesmen compared, say, to Alexander Haig or Ronald Reagan. And our allies are getting scared of us, and they're sort of clinging together, and Walter Stessel couldn't lash out about what was happening because the Soviet Union came in and picked up documents of the CIA planning a coup to get rid of the communists in Poland, the CIA interfering. And a friend of mine who was on this program with me a while back, Lydia Blades, listens to shortwave radio, and she picks up what Moscow is saying about papers that were left around, the telltale papers such as we had in the embassy in Iran and the papers in Poland. They were going to put, the CIA and the Solidaritarists were to put 80,000 people into jail. They were planning a major coup, and they were funded with strategic plans, details of the CIA. And so Mr. Stessel has to sit there, and Great Britain and France and Italy and the Netherlands and the various countries have to listen again to an American blunder and accusations going back and forth. And we're on very tender ground here. We're going to have to pull back. We've poured billions of dollars into Poland, and it's not going to work. We're making fools of ourselves again. So while some of this news is bad, and I know it's bad, it's interesting. In April, and we'll just have a few more months, a resume of 1981, I talked about the Zodiac killings in California. They were trying to make the Zodiac linked to the murders in Santa Cruz and Mount Tamalpais. Then they brought in a poor guy named Mr. Carpenter. I don't know whether he did or didn't do the murders, but all the hearings are top secret. Again, every time there's a major conspiracy, there's hoods over their heads, there's silent hearings, there are legal technicalities that draw them out for 1 and 2 years. And interesting enough, at the end of this year, I mentioned a new article in California Magazine on the code of the Zodiac killing, making it a very complex military intelligence operation out of London. And I mentioned on these programs, I think that's linked to Charles Bates and the FBI in London. And the first attempt was to bring out the Zodiac, that tired old Zodiac. He's like Carlos the terrorist. Whenever the CIA wants to spread fear or terror or murder among the native population, they'll pull out the old Zodiac letters, or in Europe it's Carlos, so they try to bring Carlos over here now to do terror. After April, there were new articles on Ronald Reagan's surgery, and that shooting took place March the 30th and April the 5th and the 12th and 19th. I did quite a bit on Ronald Reagan and the similarities to the John Kennedy assassination, and the attorney Edward Bennett Williams, for the attorney for the Hinckley family, who represented Bobby Bakers and Lyndon Johnson, Joe McCarthy and John Connolly, and again all of Richard Allen's friends and Richard Allen's links to Robert Vesco and organized crime. The man who tried to kill Ronald Reagan had base through his attorney to the mob figures, to the Nazi Party, to the George Bush family, and interestingly enough, as I say, it's been almost a year. This is the end of this year, 1981. The shooting was in March. There hasn't even been a trial, and we really haven't heard Mr. Brady say one word, just a little gibberish, or see him walk. This poor guy had his brains blown out and has gone through terrible problems this year. And in order to make the trial very easy on John Hinckley Jr., they want you to think that Mr. Brady is very happy and laughing all of the time. There were links of John Hinckley Jr. to possibly to Joseph Franklin, the fellow that was indicted in Utah, for the murder of black men with white women. And they never went further into the killings that he did. He was in Laughlin, Florida, Florence, Kentucky, Charleston, West Virginia, Fort Wayne, Indiana. There were a list of cities like the Cromer trial in Oakland, and none of these were investigated. He was supposed to have shot Jordan and that trial never was investigated to see if, in fact, he was the man who shot him. These trials are hushed up at the highest level. They're never pursued. The threads are never gone into. The defense and the prosecution work out a deal. And the overlapping links of John Hinckley Jr. to Joseph P. Franklin seemed quite common in a lot of cities. In common, of course, that was covered up. And I did quite a few broadcasts, one in particular in April, on the background of Edward Bennett Williams, the attorney for John Hinckley Jr. Incidentally, he's the attorney for Marvin Davis, who purchased 20th Century Fox and the Pebble Beach Corporation, and that includes Henry Kissinger and Anna Chenault of the Flying Tigers on the board, and Grace Kelly from Monaco. And the old mob gang have incorporated, and they have purchased this big hunk of real estate up here in Pebble Beach. And then this last week, there was an announcement that Melvin Belli, always described as the flamboyant attorney, has moved out here to Pacific Grove in California. This town is getting a little crowded for me. Having Jack Ruby's attorney over there on Pebble Beach and Pacific Grove and working in California and using the Monterey courts will be very interesting. He's more than flamboyant. He is an entire era. You take all of his clients, Mrs. Herman Goering and the Errol Flynn family with their Gestapo connections, and Jack Ruby. He's quite a character, this Melvin Belli, and he's going to be on the peninsula in a law office over here in Pacific Grove. I did some broadcasts in April on the John Hinckley family, John Hinckley Jr.'s links to the Nazi organizations, to World Vision. World Vision also had a lot of activity and money in Poland. They're in about 83 countries. They're linked to the CIA. They're the feed the poor CIA, turn the natives Christian, give them a little grain in exchange for a prayer organization. And John Hinckley's father was active in that organization. He probably still is. I did many broadcasts on the SLA intermittently, not constantly, but attended the trial of Russell Little. SLA member that was moved from up north down here to Monterey and Salinas, Monterey County. And he killed Dr. Foster just several weeks before Patty Hearst was kidnapped. That trial was a real farce. I took extensive notes and would like to buy the transcript sometime. It was no trial at all, and the prosecution and the defense all had a lot of laughs together. It was disgusting, but it was interesting to see it and to see how the system works on a day-to-day basis. And, of course, he was acquitted, and he had been heavily involved with the SLA and gets on the stand and says he doesn't even know what it was. And then when he was acquitted, then he says he knew what it was, and they don't bring him back for a hearing. I did a lot of background material on Alexander Haig last May on his the vicar of our U.S. foreign policy, his graduation from West Point, then going with Douglas MacArthur and Chiang Kai-shek and into Taiwan and into the War College, and Haig's links to the very far right, the group that, as I say, wants to build up, that have built up Poland, that are anxious for this World War III. I don't think that even though they want it, they will be able to pull it off. I think that the anxiety of Ronald Reagan, and I said this before when 1981 started, the anxiety of Reagan and the people around him to be commander-in-chief of this great force with Alexander Haig out there with his spear and dagger, leading us to this glorious war against the Soviet Union, this dream that they've had for so long, kind of fizzled. They went too fast in too short a time, and too many people got scared. The people that would have to fight the war, the people that would be our allies. And I see us now just hanging in limbo as we were at the time of the Iranian crisis, and our allies are watching us. And they're not excited about Poland, as I say, going in and breaking up the solidarity. They know it was all CIA, and we didn't achieve what we wanted, and they're not going to put their finger in it too much. There's an article in the paper today that the sanctions that Ronald Reagan wants against the Soviet Union won't work, and he may try to put them on our allies. He tried to tell them to stop buying oil from Iran. but they bought oil from Iran. My throat is dry. I'm sorry. Now, 1981, I've only covered you to 6 months. 5 months of 1981 was an interesting year. It was a sad year because events went so fast we couldn't keep up with them. But these events will be recurring in 1982. I'm losing my voice. I had the flu last night. I guess it's getting me now. These events will go on into 82 because they were unfinished in 81. And so we'll see them continue every week and follow them as they progress. I really am losing my voice. Maybe we better say. I'll see you next week. We'll take 1 minute short. This is Mae Brussel, and I'm sorry this is happening, but we'll have to stop now, and I'll come back with you next week.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussel. This program originates from Carmel, California.